Welcome back to my channel. Today we drift back in time to explore what daily life actually looked like in early 18th century Boston. From bustling streets to quiet hearths, from markets to churches, we'll uncover the lives of ordinary people and the stories often hidden from history books. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more fascinating journeys into the past. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an episode, and join us as we bring history to life, one story at a time. Imagine stepping out of a small wooden boat onto the Boston shoreline in the early 1700s. The first thing you notice is the constant blend of creaking shipmasts, shouting sailors, church bells, and wagon wheels grinding against cobblestones. Seagulls circle overhead, screeching as they dive toward scraps left near the docks. The salty smell of the Atlantic mixes with smoke drifting from dozens of chimneys and the odors of fish, tar, livestock, and unwashed streets. This isn't the polished, organized city we picture today. It feels raw, unfinished, alive, and slightly dangerous. Boston in this period is a crowded patchwork of winding streets and irregular alleyways shaped more by necessity than planning. Roads follow old cow paths and natural contours rather than any carefully designed grid. Mud clings to your boots almost immediately, especially after rain. And some parts of the street are nothing but deep ruts carved by heavy carts carrying barrels, lumber, and cargo from the harbor. Stray dogs wander freely, chickens scatter as carts approach. A cow is tied near a doorway because many families keep livestock close at hand. Everywhere you look, there are signs of work. People carrying baskets, unloading crates, repairing nets, hammering boards, or sweeping doorways with rough brooms made of bound twigs. Most of the buildings are wooden, built with steep roofs and narrow windows. Many lean slightly to one side, from years of harsh weather and repairs done on the cheap. The wood on older houses has faded to gray, and the shingles lift like scales in places where the wind has pulled at them. Clay chimneys rise from almost every house, sending up trails of smoke that join together above the town like a low gray cloud. Inside those homes, fires burn nearly all day, used for heating, cooking, and boiling water. Some homes are painted, but paint is expensive. Only the wealthier families can afford bright reds, deep blues, or creamy whites imported from England. Poorer families make do with bare wood or lime wash, doing their best to maintain what they have. You walk farther inland, following the sound of bells that call people to their daily routines. Churches stand out as some of the largest and most impressive buildings in town, their tall spires visible even from the harbor. They don't just serve as places of worship, they are social centers, political meeting spots, and moral guideposts for the entire community. In the early 1700s, religion shapes everything from how people dress, to how they speak, to how they punish misbehavior. Everyone knows who attended church and who didn't. Everyone knows who sits in the better pews up front and who must stand in the back. Social status is on quiet display at every service. As you wander, the people themselves come into focus. Most of them wear simple, practical clothing made from wool or linen. Men often wear breeches that stop at the knee, long stockings, loose shirts, and waistcoats that button down the front. On colder days, they throw heavy cloaks or greatcoats over their shoulders. Hats are almost universal broad-brimmed felt hats for farmers and tradesmen. Finer tricorn hats for merchants and officials. Women wear long dresses with aprons, bodices laced tightly over their waists, and caps covering their hair. Bright colors exist but remain rare. They are costly and usually reserved for the wealthy or special occasions. The majority of the town is dressed in shades of brown, gray, blue, and dull green, chosen more for durability than fashion. Children dart between adults, sometimes chasing each other, sometimes silently trailing a parent while carrying small bundles or buckets. Childhood is shorter here. Even the very young are expected to help in whatever way they can, watching siblings, fetching water, gathering firewood, or assisting in family shops. Some children stare curiously at strangers, but they are often taught to be quiet, respectful, and controlled, especially when elders are nearby. The sounds of the harbor continue behind you, but new noises layer on top of them as you pass deeper into the town. The rhythmic pounding of a blacksmith's hammer striking hot iron, the steady scraping of saws at a carpentry shop, and the scratchy, repetitive noise of a mill wheel turning in wind or flowing water. Businesses often operate out of homes, so you might walk past a living room where a mother rocks a baby near the fire while just a few steps away. Her husband shapes shoes, repairs barrels, or prints pamphlets. Economic life is intertwined with domestic life. Privacy barely exists. At the center of town life lies the market area, usually near the meeting house, stocks, and pillory. Here, farmers from surrounding areas sell vegetables, grains, and meat. Fishermen offer salted cod and fresh catches laid out on wooden tables. Merchants display imported items, cloth from England, sugar and molasses from the Caribbean, and spices from distant ports. Even in this early period, Boston is deeply connected to global trade. Barrel after barrel arrives, filled with food, tools, and luxury items that most colonists could never produce themselves. But these goods come at a cost. High taxes, complex trade rules, and increasing tension with British authorities simmer beneath the surface. In the corner of the square stands a reminder of public power, a whipping post or pillory. Punishments in this era are meant to be seen. Shame is considered a tool for moral correction. A thief might stand locked by the neck and wrists, while neighbors walk past making remarks, or occasionally throwing rotten vegetables. Someone who spoke disrespectfully might wear a wooden tongue-shaped device as a humiliating warning. Harsh as it seems, many colonists accept these practices as necessary for keeping order in a tight, closely watched community. You continue your walk and notice how close everything feels. Houses press in on narrow streets. Neighbors hear each other through thin walls. Conversations drift out of open windows, discussions about crops, complaints about taxes, whispered gossip about who married whom, who argued with the minister, or who didn't show up to church last Sunday. Privacy exists only in fragments. Moment behind a closed door, a quiet walk to fetch water, a few whispered words before bed. In a city this small, reputations matter. One scandal can follow a family for years, yet life isn't only stern rules and constant labor. There are moments of laughter and community everywhere. Children play games in open spaces. Women gather to sew, talk, and exchange news while minding their chores. Men stop at taverns in the evenings where candles flicker and mugs of ale or rum are served. These taverns buzz with conversation, storytelling, singing, and debates about politics and religion. For many people, they are the only places where they can relax after exhausting days. The smells of cooking drift through the streets in the late afternoon, stews bubbling over hearths, bread baking inside brick ovens, fish roasting over open flames. Though ingredients are simple, meals mean warmth and togetherness. Families gather around wooden tables, often saying prayers before eating. Candles or lanterns cast long shadows on the walls. And after dinner, people might mend clothes, sharpen tools, read from the Bible, or simply sit quietly listening to the crackle of the fire. As daylight fades, darkness comes quickly. There are no streetlights except for an occasional lantern hung outside a wealthy home or public building. Nighttime makes Boston feel entirely different. The bustle disappears. Only a few figures move along the paths, usually carrying a lantern, or guided by moonlight. Night watchmen patrol, calling out the hours and checking for fires, one of the greatest dangers in a city built mostly from wood. The fear of flames devouring entire neighborhoods hangs constantly in people's minds. Buckets sit ready in doorways, and neighbors are expected to rush to help anytime smoke is seen. Despite the constant danger, colonists develop resilience. Storms tear through the harbor and damage ships they rebuild. Winters bring freezing temperatures and heavy snow that blocks roads and chills homes to the bone they endure. Disease spreads, sometimes taking entire families within weeks. They mourn, then continue, because survival leaves no other option. Strength becomes a necessity, not a choice. Education in Boston, especially among boys, is valued more than in many other colonies. You pass a small schoolhouse where students sit on benches, learning to read and write from hornbooks' thin wooden paddles with printed letters protected by transparent horn. Their lessons focus heavily on scripture. Discipline is strict. A boy who speaks out of turn or misbehaves might be struck lightly or shamed in front of classmates. But for parents who can afford to send their children, education offers the promise of advancement. A literate son might become a clerk, printer, minister, or teacher instead of working forever in manual trades. Printing presses, though still relatively few, play a massive role in shaping Boston society. Pamphlets and early newspapers begin to circulate, spreading information, opinion, and rumor faster than word of mouth alone. When major events occur, a new law, a shipwreck, an outbreak of disease, the entire city can learn about it within days. These printed words of mouth alone. When major events occur, new law, a shipwreck, an outbreak of disease, the entire city can learn about it within days. These printed words become fuel for future debate and political change. You notice that while Boston feels bustling, it is still small in global terms, home to perhaps around 15,000 people. Many of them are recent arrivals or descendants of immigrants from England and Scotland, along with enslaved Africans, indentured servants, and a shrinking presence of native people pushed increasingly to the margins. Languages mix, accents vary. Tension lingers beneath interactions between different economic and social classes. But for most residents, the main focus remains simple survival keeping, homes warm, keeping food stored, raising children, and staying within the expectations of their community. The wharf area where you first arrived almost acts as the city's lifeline. Ships are constantly loading and unloading, their crews shouting directions. Crates filled with sugar, tobacco, lumber, tools, fabrics, and rum are dragged ashore. Some ports smell strongly of molasses, sticky and sweet as barrels leak slightly in the sun. Boston's economy thrives because of the Atlantic world, connected to markets thousands of miles away. Few colonists travel across the ocean themselves, but almost all depend on what comes from it. The deeper you explore, the more contradictions you see. On one street, wealthy merchants live in larger houses containing imported furniture, decorative mirrors, and silverware. Their homes look neatly maintained, and their wives often wear finer fabrics and jewelry. A few blocks away, families cram into cramped rooms, sharing space with animals, working long hours simply to afford bread and firewood. Poverty is visible in worn clothing, cracked shoes, and tired faces, but most poor families continue to work with remarkable determination. The city is layered not only in geography but in opportunity. The rules that govern social behavior are strict, and reputations can be fragile. Gossip travels fast. A person known for laziness, dishonesty, or drunkenness may find it hard to be hired or trusted. Marriages are watched closely, followed with interest. Widows and orphans often rely on neighbors or church assistants. Life creates deep interdependence. People need blacksmiths, carpenters, midwives, fishermen, farmers, pastors, and merchants, and each relies on the others in turn. In the midst of all this activity, the natural world still presses in close. Forests remain just beyond town boundaries, filled with deer, wolves, and thick underbrush. Winters freeze the harbor partially and glaze rooftops with ice. Summer brings humidity, insects, and the constant risk of illness. Storms roll in off the ocean with incredible force. No one is insulated from nature. Even the wealthiest families feel the impact of harsh seasons, though the poorest suffer most. Over time, as you observe, a picture forms. Daily life in early 18th century Boston is a blend of hardship and hope, strict discipline and lively energy, fear of disorder, and hunger for opportunity. Every object, from a wooden bucket to a church pew, tells a story of labor. Every face reveals someone who has endured cold winters, loss, exhaustion, and yet continues waking early each morning to start again. And yet beneath the routines and struggles, something else slowly develops, a sense that life here is different from life in Europe. People have more land, more involvement in local government, and more room, however limited, to voice frustrations. They begin to question, quietly at first, why distant rulers across the ocean hold such power over their taxes, trade, and laws. Those questions don't yet dominate daily life, but they hover quietly in tavern conversations and church discussions. They linger in the printed pamphlets and whispered disagreements. The seeds of rebellion are there, not yet fully visible, but deep in the soil beneath everyone's feet. So, as you stand in the middle of this early Boston, the city feels like a place suspended between worlds, part raw frontier settlement, part bustling trading port, part moral community guided by strict rules and part emerging society, filled with curiosity about the future. It is noisy, messy, imperfect, and difficult, but it is also vibrant, determined, and quietly transformative. The people living here don't yet realize that history will later call their city one of the birthplaces of a revolution. For them, this is simply home, a place where every day brings new work, new worries, and the fragile hope that tomorrow might be just a little better than today. Before dawn, long before the streets begin to buzz with activity, Boston is quiet, except for the faint rustling of wind through the narrow alleys and the soft creak of ships tied along the harbor. Inside nearly every home, the day begins not with clocks or alarms, but with habit. Roosters crow, a baby stirs. The last embers in the hearth glow faintly. Someone reaches for flint and steel, blowing gently into a handful of tinder to coax the fire back to life. Fire, more than anything else, dictates the rhythm of the day. Without it, there is no warmth, no breakfast, no boiled water, no light for early chores. The first to rise is usually the person responsible for the fire, often the mother, older daughter, or a servant in wealthier homes. She moves quietly, so as not to wake those still sleeping, feeding small sticks into the embers until flame returns. In winter, her breath fogs as she works, and her hands ache from cold. She may have slept only a few hours, but the day waits for no one. Soon, the smell of wood smoke begins to seep from chimneys across town, and Boston slowly stirs awake. Men stretch stiffly from straw mattresses or shared wooden beds. Their bodies carry the weight of yesterday's labor, backs sore from lifting barrels, shoulders aching from hauling nets, hands rough and cracked from tools and ropes. They do not complain much. Aches simply mean the body is doing what it was made to do. A quick prayer, sometimes spoken aloud, sometimes whispered, silently marks the start of the day for many families. Gratitude for survival, hope for health, fear of sickness or accidents, these thoughts accompany the first moments of morning. Breakfast is not a leisurely affair. It is practical and often repetitive, a pot of porridge made from cornmeal or oats, perhaps some bread left over from the day before, sometimes a bit of salted fish or cheese. People eat quickly because daylight matters. Work depends on it. In summer, light stretches long and allows for hours of activity. In winter, darkness arrives early, and every spare hour must be used wisely. Children gulp their food, still half asleep, rubbing their eyes, and already hearing their tasks being listed for them. Step outside, and the town transforms with remarkable speed. Doors open, boots clap against wooden steps. The blacksmith heads toward his forge, the fisherman toward his small boat, the apprentice toward the workshop where his master will soon demand full attention. Each street grows noisier as carts begin rolling, pulled by horses or oxen, their iron rims rattling across uneven stone. Merchants unlock shop doors. A printer arranges type for the day's pages, lining up letters one by one, each word slowly coming into existence. No job is easy, and nearly every job requires skill shaped by years of repetition. For men working the harbor, the day begins with tides. They know instinctively when the water rises and falls. They read the sea the way others read books. Fishermen push off into the gray morning, the smell of salt thick in the air. They drop nets or lines, muscles pulling rhythmically, and their thoughts stay practical. Will the catch be good? Will the weather hold? Will the price at market be enough to feed the family this week? They work with quiet cooperation, communicating more by gesture than by words, each man understanding what the others need without having to ask. Shipbuilders, meanwhile, shape entire worlds from wood. They study curves, measure planks, drive iron nails with calculated force. Their hands move confidently because mistakes cost dearly. A poorly built hull means leaks. A misaligned beam could doom a ship and everyone aboard. The smell of pitch and resin lingers around them, sticking to their clothes and skin. Boys serving as apprentices run errands, fetching tools, carrying boards, sweeping sawdust, and, above all, watching and learning. These boys are expected to grow into the work without complaint. Apprenticeship is both opportunity and discipline. Masters provide training and sometimes room and board, but they also demand obedience, long hours, and strict behavior. Another layer of Boston's daily routine unfolds inside homes and small shops, usually driven by women's labor. From morning until night, the household becomes a workshop, kitchen, schoolroom, and infirmary all at once. Water must be hauled again and again from wells or pumps. Laundry must be boiled and scrubbed on washboards, a task so exhausting it is often spread over several days. Bread dough must be kneaded and left to rise near the warm hearth, then baked at the right moment. Vegetables need chopping. Meat needs salting. Milk must be churned into butter before it spoils. A crying infant interrupts every task, demanding to be fed, burped, rocked, or wrapped more tightly, far from the image of quiet domestic simplicity. Managing a colonial home is closer to running a small business. There is accounting to track what food remains for winter, planning to decide when to slaughter an animal, constant mending of clothes that wear through quickly, tending of gardens, and supervision of older children who are learning skills they'll need for life. In some families, the mother also keeps records for a husband's trade or helps sell goods from their front room. Work spills from every corner. And leisure is a rare luxury, saved mostly for Sundays or special celebrations. Children absorb this world gradually. A boy might follow his father to the wharf to learn knots or how to judge the quality of fish. A girl might learn the rhythm of spinning wheels and the soft pull required to twist fibers into thread. Play exists, but it is built around chores, games with pebbles, races while gathering kindling, pretend cooking beside the real hearth. Out of necessity, children's work becomes training, and training becomes identity. A child destined to be a cooper begins life surrounded by barrels. A child meant for farming learns seasons before learning full sentences. Some children, especially boys from families with modest means, are sent to school for part of the year. They carry hornbooks or small slates, and they memorize letters, numbers, and religious passages. But school does not remove them from work, it simply fits around it. When harvest season arrives or a father falls ill, a boy may be pulled from lessons to provide labor at home. Schoolmasters discipline firmly because they believe obedience prepares boys for both faith and citizenship. A miswritten word might bring stern correction. A lie or act of disrespect could bring humiliation or a physical reminder to behave. Meanwhile, Boston's craftsmen, cobblers, tailors, carpenters, tinsmiths, printers fill their days with tasks requiring patience. A cobbler sits bent over a shoe last, hammering small nails into leather. A tailor draws chalk lines on cloth before cutting carefully, knowing every inch is valuable. Waste is unacceptable. Materials cost too much to squander. Even simple objects, such as buckets and brooms, involve layers of practice that most people today seldom appreciate. Everything durable must be crafted by hand, inspected by eye, tested by use. Merchants, often seen as more fortunate, experience their own pressures. They begin the day looking over account books, calculating debts, worrying about shipments delayed by storms or piracy. Their wealth depends on ships arriving safely and on rules set by distant British officials. A cargo stuck at port could erase profits for months. Merchants deal constantly with negotiations, promises, and risks. They may not lift heavy crates themselves, but the weight of uncertainty sits heavily on their shoulders. Throughout the town, church bells punctuate the day, like exclamation marks. They ring to mark time, to call people to worship, to announce meetings, or to signal danger. Everyone listens. Bells remind them of order in a world that often feels unpredictable. But order also comes from neighbors quietly watching one another. Laziness, drunkenness, or wastefulness rarely go unnoticed. A man who fails to provide, a woman rumored to neglect her children, a youth caught stealing all face not only legal consequences, but also the longer sting of community judgment. Daily life is a constant negotiation between personal needs and communal expectations. As midday approaches, work slows just enough for a small meal. Households prepare stews or leftover porridge, and workers return briefly when possible. Taverns offer simple fare for those who live farther from homebread, cheese, ale, maybe a bowl of soup. People talk little at midday. They are gathering energy for the second half of the day, which often stretches long into evening. Those responsible for livestock head out again to tend animals. Carpenters return to their beams. Printers resume arranging rows of metal letters and turning heavy presses. Fishermen sort their catches, gutting and cleaning fish so they can be salted or sold quickly before they spoil. Not every task is visible. Some work remains tucked away in attics or cellars. There, women spin wool, weave cloth, or dip candles repeatedly into melted tallow to build up layers. The smell of candle making can be unpleasant, but candles mean light for reading, sewing, prayer, and conversation after the sun sets. Without them, the day would stop entirely at dusk. The effort poured into even the smallest object reveals how carefully colonists must think about time. They constantly prepare for the hours or months ahead because they cannot simply purchase replacements whenever they wish. That, as shadows grow longer, the pace of work does not immediately slow. In shops, masters inspect apprentices' progress, offering grudging praise when something is done well, sharp criticism when it is not. Some apprentices dream of someday owning their own shops. Others simply hope to survive the harsh training and gain independence. Their contracts can last 7 years or more, binding them not only to labor, but to loyalty, obedience, and moral behavior. A runaway apprentice risks public punishment and the loss of all future opportunity. Women's work intensifies in late afternoon. Dinner must be prepared. Bread needs to be pulled from ovens without burning. Stew must be thickened. Vegetables cleaned. Bowls set out. Younger children begin to fuss from hunger and fatigue. Teenagers return from errands or lessons and immediately fall into chores, collecting more wood for the evening, sweeping floors, bringing water, or helping care for animals. The household becomes a flurry of movement, each person acting according to an unwritten routine practiced daily since childhood. When families finally sit together, the meal is not always large, but it is meaningful. Sometimes the conversation centers on small victories: a good catch, a repaired tool, a successful trade at market. Other nights bring heavier topics: illness rumored to be spreading, a ship reported missing, a new tax announced by British authorities. Fathers may remind children to be grateful, while mothers encourage them to finish quickly, so remaining chores can be completed before dark. Meals connect generations. The stories told at these table stories about harsh winters, survived ancestors who crossed the ocean, neighbors who helped in times of crisis, become part of the family's shared memory. After dinner, work still calls. Tools must be cleaned and put away. The hearth must be fed with larger logs to last into the night. Clothing worn thin during the day is repaired by lamplight. Some fathers read aloud from the Bible or from the rare book owned by the family, guiding discussions that blend moral lessons with everyday advice. Children listen, yawning, absorbing beliefs as naturally as they absorb language. Outside, night deepens and the soundscape shifts once more. The chorus of work fades, replaced by the occasional bark of a dog or the watchman's distant call marking the hour. Yet even in these quieter moments, anxiety does not disappear. Fires can start unexpectedly. Thieves sometimes roam. Illness can strike without warning, stealing strength in a matter of days. Parents watch their sleeping children with the constant awareness that tomorrow is never guaranteed. This fragile sense of uncertainty shapes how they view life. Hard work is not just a duty, it is a shield against chaos, a way of surviving in a world that offers few guarantees. Before sleep, some take a final step outside to gaze at the sky. Without artificial light, the stars appear sharp and numerous. The harbor reflects faint moonlight. The air feels colder and more honest somehow. A man might think of debts he still owes, or of fields needing attention, or of a son whose future he hopes will be better than his own. A woman might think about the next loaf of bread, the next wash day, the health of an aging parent. Their thoughts rarely drift toward luxury or ambition. More often they circle around responsibility, faith, and perseverance. Slowly the town settles, windows darken, fires burn low. People crawl into beds shared by siblings, spouses, sometimes even boarders or apprentices. Quilts and heavy blankets shield them from drafts sneaking through wall cracks. They whisper prayers, asking for protection from storms, thieves, or sudden illness. For a few hours, stillness finally arrives, broken only by the steady lap of water against the docks and the quiet creak of timbers in old houses. The cycle will repeat tomorrow and the next day and the next. Days blur into seasons. Seasons blur into years. But within that repetition lies the heart of Boston's daily life. In the early 18th century, relentless work is balanced by community, labor tied to survival, faith stitched to everything, like thread through cloth. People rise with the sun, not because they wish to, but because survival requires it. Children join the rhythm early because the future depends on their hands. Women hold households together with endless effort. Men carve livelihoods out of sea, wood, metal, and trade. And though the era's great political events may someday dominate history books, it is this ordinary, exhausting routine that truly builds the foundation beneath all of it. Every barrel rolled, every fish cleaned, every page printed, every loaf baked. These unnoticed acts keep the city alive long enough for larger ideas to eventually take shape. The work of daily life, quiet and uncelebrated, becomes the steady drumbeat that carries Boston forward into a century of change it cannot yet imagine. If you linger a little longer in early 18th century Boston, you begin to see that daily life isn't just defined by work. It's shaped by the invisible rules, unspoken expectations, and quiet hopes that guide people from the moment they wake to the moment they fall asleep. The town looks ordinary on the surface, but beneath it lies a complex web of customs, responsibilities, and relationships that hold everything together. Without these shared understandings, the city would feel chaotic. With them, it functions almost like a living organism, each person playing a part they rarely question. A typical Boston home is more than just shelter. It is a workshop, a nursery, a place of worship, and sometimes even a sick room or courtroom for private disputes. Walls are thin, floors are rough, furniture is simple and mostly handmade. A few stools, a heavy table, perhaps a chest for storing clothing, and a bed constructed of ropes tied beneath a straw mattress. Every object has value. Nothing is wasted. A cracked bowl isn't thrown away, it is repaired with metal staples. A worn coat becomes a smaller garment for a child. And when even that is no longer usable, it becomes rags for cleaning or patches for quilts. The idea of excess barely exists. Resources are scarce, and people are skilled at stretching them as far as possible. Lighting is another constant challenge. During winter, darkness arrives like an early guest who refuses to leave. Candles are carefully rationed, often reserved only for necessary tasks. Families sometimes gather around the hearth not just for warmth, but because it's one of the only places where enough light exists to see clearly. The fire becomes a center of storytelling, reflection, and planning. Parents talk softly about next season's crops or discuss which debts need paying. Children listen and learn silently, understanding that adulthood will someday bring the same responsibilities. Outside the home, Boston streets tell their own stories. People pass each other constantly, nodding, greeting, or sometimes pretending not to see. Everyone knows who belongs to which family, who had recent trouble with the law, who owes money, and who is quietly struggling. A widow might walk with slightly stooped shoulders, carrying both grief and the fear of financial hardship. A successful merchant may stride confidently, though even he worries about fluctuating markets and fragile supply chains across the ocean. Appearances do not always reveal burdens, but in a town this small, they are rarely hidden for long. religion shapes nearly every interaction. Sunday is not a casual day off. It is serious, structured, and long. Families dress in their best fawn, clothes that are slightly uncomfortable because they are worn rarely and must last many years. They sit through lengthy sermons that explore moral duty, sin, and discipline. Ministers speak with authority, and their words ripple through the community. Throughout the week, after services, conversations outside the meeting house continue almost as seriously as the sermon itself. People discuss neighbors' behavior, the minister's warnings, the state of the community's soul. The church is not simply about faith, it is also about social order and control. At the same time, taverns and inns offer a completely different energy. Candles flicker over rough wooden tables. The smell of ale, tobacco smoke, and cooked meat fills the air. Men gather after long days, talking about crops, fishing, trade, or ships arriving from distant ports. Some discussions drift toward politics, and though they may seem quiet and harmless, they often carry the earliest seeds of dissatisfaction with distant British authority. In these dimly lit rooms, ideas travel faster than ships, a rumor repeated enough times becomes a shared belief. A complaint echoed across different taverns grows slowly into collective frustration. Even without realizing it, ordinary people shape the direction of history through these conversations. Medicine and health reveal just how fragile life truly is. Illness appears suddenly. A simple infection can become deadly. Remedies consist mostly of herbs, poultices, bleeding, or purging treatments based on limited understanding of the human body. Midwives attend births with calm hands and steady nerves. But childbirth remains dangerous. Many mothers and infants never survive the process. Death is not hidden away. It is a constant companion. Children grow up attending funerals, hearing prayers beside open graves, watching families mourn openly before returning almost immediately to daily labor. Grief cannot stop survival, and so people learn to carry loss alongside hope. Hot summers bring swarms of insects and the constant odor of refuse on streets. Winter, however, is harsher in its own way. Cold seeps through cracks in walls. Ice forms inside windows. People sleep close together under layers of blankets, sharing body heat. Food storage becomes critical. Barrels of salted meat, pickled vegetables, and dried fish line cellars. If supplies run low before spring arrives, hunger becomes a very real threat. Families calculate carefully, measuring out rations and living in quiet awareness that one bad season could change everything. The role of law and punishment is impossible to ignore. While Boston lacks large prisons, punishment is swift and public. A man convicted of theft might be branded. Someone guilty of fraud may face the pillory, exposed for hours, while neighbors mock or scold them. The purpose is not simply punishment, it is warning. The message is clear. Behavior affects the entire community. Everyone must contribute to stability. The constant visibility of justice reinforces the belief that personal actions ripple outward, affecting far more than the individual. Enslaved people also live within this city, often hidden in plain sight. Though Boston is not a plantation town like those farther south, slavery still exists and shapes daily economics quietly but powerfully. Enslaved men and women labor in kitchens, fields, homes, and docks, performing tasks that keep wealthier households running smoothly. Their experiences are defined by restriction and uncertainty. Their stories are rarely written down, yet they form an undeniable part of the city's foundation. In whispered moments among themselves, they share fragments of memory, songs from homeland's hopes that someday circumstances might change. Freedom feels distant, yet not unimaginable. Relationships between social classes are complicated. A wealthy merchant may rely heavily on the labor of sailors, porters, craftsmen, and servantspeople who earn far less but carry equal or greater physical burdens. Respect is often expected, though not always earned. Many poorer families silently resent those who seem comfortable while they struggle. Yet they also understand that anger brings risk. Survival encourages patience, but beneath the surface hums a tension that will one day find its voice. Hygiene, too, reflects the realities of the age. Bathing is infrequent not out of neglect, but because hauling water is laborious and heating it consumes precious fuel. Most people wash hands and faces daily, but full body immersion might occur only a few times a year. Cleanliness is maintained through linen undergarments changed regularly, thorough combing, and careful laundering. Illness spreads rapidly in crowded quarters, often with devastating effect. Families keep vinegar, sage, and camphor nearby, believing these substances ward off miasmas, the bad air thought to carry disease. Yet life persists with stubborn grace. In the dim glow of a tallow candle, a mother hums a lullaby passed down through generations. A father carves a small toy for his child from a scrap of wood. Neighbors share firewood when one runs low. These small acts, sun-recorded, unremarkable are the true mortar of daily life. Boston in the early 18th century is not a monument. It is a mosaic of ordinary effort, stitched together by necessity, faith, and quiet resilience. Its people do not dream of founding nations. They rise each morning to feed their families, tend their trades, honor their neighbors, and survive another day. And in doing so, without knowing it, they lay the groundwork for a future far grander than they could imagine. Patience does not erase inequality. These tensions remain largely unspoken, simmering quietly beneath the town's daily calm. Education shapes the future, yet remains uneven. Boys with ambition may attend schools, apprenticeships, or religious training, while girls often receive instruction at home, focusing mostly on domestic skills. A few exceptional families encourage daughters to read and write more deeply, recognizing the strength of an educated mind. But society still largely assumes a woman's world should revolve around home, family, and faith. Despite this, many women quietly become powerful organizers, managing finances, orchestrating household survival strategies, and guiding their children's values. Their influence, though often invisible to formal history, echoes through generations. Trade networks connect Boston to places most residents will never see. Ships sail to the Caribbean, loaded with fish, lumber, and livestock, returning with sugar, molasses, and rum. Others head toward Europe, moving along well-established routes that bring news, fashion, and political directives. A shipment delayed by storms or pirates causes immediate concern. Letters take months to travel and return. Communication is slow. forcing people to live in long stretches of uncertainty, waiting for word about loved ones or financial matters that could determine their future stability. Amid all the seriousness, people still find laughter. A group of boys might race down a muddy road, their laughter echoing off wooden houses. Neighbors gather for celebrations when weddings occur, feasting and dancing with surprising energy. Seasonal holidays break the monotony of work, allowing families to share special meals, exchange small gifts, and feel, if only briefly, a sense of abundance. These moments shine more brightly because they are rare. Even the simple act of sitting together on a warm evening, listening to crickets, and watching the horizon darken feels meaningful in a world where every day demands effort. Gossip flows like another form of currency. Stories about misbehavior, secret romances, or unusual events travel quickly. Some gossip is harmless entertainment. Other times, it becomes sharp and dangerous, shifting public opinion against someone in ways that can last for years. Reputation is everything. A man accused of dishonesty, even without proof, may struggle to sell his goods. A woman rumored. Amid all the seriousness, people still find laughter. A group of boys might race down a muddy road, their laughter echoing off wooden houses. Neighbors gather for celebrations when weddings occur, feasting and dancing with surprising energy. Seasonal holidays break the monotony of work, allowing families to share special meals, exchange small gifts, and feel, if only briefly, a sense of abundance. These moments shine more brightly because they are rare. Even the simple act of sitting together on a warm evening, listening to crickets and watching the horizon darken, feels meaningful in a world where every day demands effort. Gossip flows like another form of currency. Stories about misbehavior, secret romances, or unusual events travel quickly. Some gossip is harmless entertainment. Other times, it becomes sharp and dangerous, shifting public opinion against someone in ways that can last for years. Reputation is everything. A man accused of dishonesty, even without proof, may struggle to sell his goods. A woman rumored to be improper might find invitations suddenly disappearing. Fear of judgment keeps many people cautious, constantly aware of how they are perceived. Nature remains both ally and adversary. The sea provides fish, but also storms capable of wrecking ships in minutes. Forests offer timber, but hide wolves and freezing winds. Disease spreads more easily in crowded neighborhoods. Fires threaten to consume entire sections of town. Every improvement people make, every fence built, well dug, roof repaired, feels like an act of defiance against the unpredictability of the world around them. They carve order from wilderness, one plank and stone at a time. Yet beneath all of these hardships lies an emerging sense of identity. Boston is not just a copy of England. People feel it, even if they cannot yet explain it fully. They govern their towns through meetings where ordinary men debate issues. They challenge rules they believe unfair. They discuss rights, responsibilities, and what it truly means to be loyal. This slow, growing confidence doesn't erase loyalty to the British Crown, but it plants the thought that perhaps, in time, their voices should carry more weight in determining their own destiny. Evenings bring a strange mixture of exhaustion and reflection. After chores are finished and children drift toward sleep, adults sometimes sit quietly, letting silence fill the gaps between thoughts. In these peaceful spaces, they remember loved ones lost, imagine futures for their children, and occasionally wonder if tomorrow will bring opportunity or hardship. Life rarely offers clarity, but it always requires resilience. Through all of this, one unspoken truth connects everyone, whether rich or poor, free or enslaved, devout or doubtful. Survival is a collective effort. The town depends on cooperation as much as on individual strength. A neighbor helps another mend a roof after a storm. Women share bread with a widow facing hunger. Sailors assist families when storms keep men at sea longer than expected. Acts of kindness do not erase inequality, but they soften its edges and remind people that humanity still matters. Each day might appear ordinary, but it is built on thousands of necessary choices: when to plant crops, when to mend nets, how to heal a wound, how to discipline a child, when to speak, and when to remain silent. These choices, repeated generation after generation, shape the character of the community. They prepare Boston, quietly, unknowingly, for the moment when history will call upon it to take a larger role. For now, however, the people of early 18th century Boston live mostly inside their daily routines. They wake, work, pray, eat, worry, plan, laugh occasionally, and hope persistently. Their world feels smaller than ours, yet it is full, demanding, and deeply human. Nothing is simple, but everything has purpose. And though they cannot see the future waiting just beyond the horizon, their lives, every chore, every hardship, every shared moment are already building the foundation for the dramatic events that will someday transform their city and the world beyond it. Food in early 18th century Boston was not something people thought about as cuisine or lifestyle. It was survival, routine, and tradition wrapped together. Most meals began long before anyone actually sat at the table. Before dawn, a fire needed to be coaxed back to life from yesterday's embers, or built again from scratch. Firewood had to be chopped, carried, and stacked. Water had to be hauled in heavy buckets from a well or pump, sometimes several trips, even in the freezing winter. Everything that ended up on a plate represented dozens of unseen steps, often done by tired hands. And because there were no refrigerators, no supermarkets, and few guarantees, every household lived with the quiet fear that food stores might run out before the next harvest or shipment arrived. The typical Boston table did not overflow with variety. Bread was a constant companion, usually dense and coarse, baked from wheat when it could be afforded, but more often mixed with rye, cornmeal, or barley to stretch supplies. Cornmeal mush, known as hasty pudding, was another staple. It was cheap, filling, and endlessly reused, eaten fresh in the morning, fried for supper, or mixed into stews the next day. The idea of food going to waste was almost unthinkable. Leftovers weren't leftovers. They were simply tomorrow's breakfast. Fish was everywhere. The Atlantic world of the 18th century revolved around shipping, trade, and fishing, and Boston stood right at the edge of that salty network. Cod, in particular, shaped lives and fortunes. Boats left the harbor daily, and salted cod traveled across oceans. Families ate it stewed, boiled, fried, or simply cooked with onions and herbs. When available, fresh fish was a blessing. Salted fish was security. If a barrel was in the cellar, there was at least some confidence that winter hunger could be held off. Meat was not rare. but it wasn't eaten in the large portions modern people expect. Chickens provided eggs first, meat second. Cows were valued for milk far more than beef. When animals were butchered, nearly every part was used: bones for broth, fat for cooking or candles, organs for pies. Sausage and preserved meats allowed scraps to last longer. Pork was common because pigs could live on scraps and forage, turning waste into food. Still, large roasted joints, like we see in movies, were holiday luxuries, not daily fare for most families. For the poorer classes, salted pork pieces added flavor to stews more than served as the main dish. Vegetables followed the rhythm of the seasons. In summer, gardens produced peas, beans, carrots, pumpkins, turnips, and cabbages. In winter, those same vegetables appeared againly pickled, salted, or stored in root cellars. There was no concept of strawberries in December or fresh lettuce year-round, and people learned to rely on hearty foods that could endure squash, potatoes, onions, and preserved fruits. Apple cider replaced fresh fruit for much of the year and served as both drink and ingredient. Cooking itself was slow and laborious. A single pot simmering over the fire might provide meals for the whole day. Stews were popular because they stretched ingredients and softened tough cuts of meat. Women mastered the art of judging heat by watching flames and embers shifting pots closer or farther without thermometers or timers. Burns were common. Smoke-filled kitchens, stinging eyes, and blackening walls. Yet, out of that discomfort came meals that carried families through seasons of work, sickness, and cold. Beverages reveal another side of Boston life. Tea imported from overseas was both a comfort and a symbol. Wealthier homes displayed tea sets proudly, creating small rituals around pouring and sharing. To sip tea was to participate in a wider world of trade and culture. But tea was expensive, and its price and the taxes attached to it would soon make it politically charged. Still, in the early part of the century, it was simply a cherished, slightly luxurious habit. Rum, however, was everywhere. The rum trade connected Boston to the Caribbean and Africa, forming part of the infamous triangle of goods, profits, and human lives. For many Bostonians, rum was cheaper and sometimes safer than water, which could be contaminated. Taverns poured it, constantly plain rum, rum mixed with water, rum punch flavored with citrus, and hot toddies sweetened with molasses. Workers drank it at midday, sailors relied on it for courage and warmth. Clergymen scolded excess drinking, while quietly acknowledging how deeply it had woven into daily routines, whether celebratory or destructive. Rum was one of the quiet engines of colonial society. Meals were family gatherings, but they followed hierarchy. Fathers were often served first, children last. Guests received honor, and servants or enslaved. People ate separately if they joined at all. Silence during meals was common, broken occasionally by short family prayers or practical discussion. Eating was not entertainment. It was nourishment, discipline, and routine all at once, beyond the table. Religion shaped the rhythm of Bostonian life in ways modern people sometimes struggle to imagine. Sunday was not just another day. It was the anchor of the week. Bells rang early, signaling the beginning of a ritual that everyone willingly or unwillingly participated in. Churches were simple but imposing, with tall steeples pointing toward heaven and wooden pews worn smooth over years of use. Families walked or rode together, often traveling long distances through mud, snow, or heat. Services could last hours. Sermons were dense, moral, and sometimes stern. Preachers warned about sin, pride, idleness, and temptation. They connected everyday struggles to spiritual lessons and urged people to see their lives as part of a grand divine narrative. The language might sound harsh today, but for many colonists, these sermons gave meaning to hardship. Suffering, discipline, and sacrifice were framed as pathways to virtue. Children sat stiffly beside their parents, often bored, sometimes restless. Bead toys were occasionally given to the youngest to keep their hands busy. Strict ushers patrolled aisles, ready to correct anyone who whispered or fidgeted too loudly. Falling asleep was risky. Someone might gently but firmly tap you awake, with a long stick designed specifically for that purpose. Religion also extended far beyond church walls. It shaped laws and expectations. Many towns enforced Sabbath rules that limited activities on Sundays: no loud work, no unnecessary travel, no obvious enjoyment that could distract from worship. Neighbors quietly watched one another, partly out of curiosity and partly because community order depended on shared behavior. Faith offered belonging, but also pressure. You were expected to present yourself as upright, respectable, and pious, regardless of what doubts might exist privately. Yet Boston was not spiritually frozen. As trade expanded and books circulated, new ideas entered the port along with goods. Enlightenment thinkers questioned authority and encouraged reason. Revivalist preachers swept through towns, urging emotional, personal connections to God instead of rigid ritual. Some residents embraced these movements enthusiastically, while others feared they would tear apart established traditions. Religious life became a conversation, sometimes heated, about what faith should look like. Community life grew in the spaces between home, church, and work. People depended on one another in ways that are sometimes hard to picture now. A broken tool might require a neighbor's help. Illness meant the entire street might bring broths, blankets, and prayers. Births, marriages, and funerals drew crowds because every event was part of a shared story. News traveled not through screens, but through voices, whispered in markets, announced from pulpits, or spread rapidly through taverns. Those taverns were more than drinking places. They functioned as town squares, newspapers, meeting halls, and debate stages all at once. Sailors returning from months at sea brought tales of storms, pirates, and far-off lands. Merchants compared prices and planned deals. Ordinary workers argued about taxes, government, and local leaders. Some nights were rowdy, others thoughtful. On the walls, notices advertised auctions, missing goods, runaway apprentices, and ships scheduled to depart. With every conversation, Boston became a little more aware of itself and the wider world. Entertainment existed, though it was quieter compared to modern standards. Music came from fiddles, flutes, and voices around fireplaces. Dances were held. Occasionally, though strict moralists frowned upon too much merriment. Fairs and market days offered rare chances to see performers, tricks, and unusual goods. Young people often courted under supervision, walking together after church, or attending small gatherings. Courtship was not purely romantic, it was social. Negotiation linking families, property, and future stability. Community also meant mutual responsibility. When roads needed repairing, neighbors might gather for collective labor. When barns were raised, dozens of men lifted beams together, while women prepared food to feed the workers. These gatherings built bonds as strong as the structures themselves. People argued and sometimes held grudges, but they also understood that survival depended on cooperation. At the same time, deep inequalities ran beneath this sense of togetherness. Enslaved Africans and their descendants lived in many Boston households, often invisible in public records, except as property. They cooked, cleaned, hauled water, cared for children, and toiled without freedom while listening to sermons about liberty preached to others. Their relationship to food, religion, and community was filtered through constraint. They were expected to obey quietly, yet they preserved fragments of culture, whispered stories, and personal faith amid oppression. Servants, apprentices, and the poor also formed a different layer of society. They ate simpler food, worked longer hours, and had little control over their schedules. Apprentices might sleep in cramped lofts above workshops, their days dominated by labor and training. Widows frequently relied on community charity or small home businesses such as laundry or boarding. Community notices often listed donations for those struck by fire or famine. Tragedies were frequent shipwrecks, epidemics, accidents involving horses or wagons. Every household eventually encountered loss, and neighbors gathered not only to work and celebrate, but to grieve. Despite hardships, people learned to find joy in small moments. A successful harvest meant relief and quiet celebration. The first warm day after a brutal winter felt almost like a blessing. The smell of fresh bread, the laughter of children playing in dusty streets, or a letter arriving from across the ocean could brighten entire days. Stories by the fire connected generations, passing down not only history, but wisdom, how to fish, how to mend clothes, how to survive. Food, customs, revealed identity. Recipes were inherited, altered, and shared among families with English roots. Indigenous influences and African traditions. Dishes slowly evolved, shaped by trade and scarcity. Meanwhile, religious festivals and fasts influenced meals too. Certain days called for simpler fare, encouraging reflection. Other times permitted small feasts, marking moments of gratitude and seasonal change. Everything was tied to rhythm, the rhythm of planting, of worship, of tides and trade winds. Markets in Boston provided glimpses of diversity. Farmers brought eggs, butter, and vegetables. Fishermen sold their catches. Merchants displayed imported spices, sugar, and cloth. The smells were powerful: salt, smoke, fresh herbs, and animal hides. Bartering was common, haggling expected. People gossiped as they shopped, asking who was engaged, who fell sick, which ships had docked recently. News flowed through those stalls as much as goods. Letters and newspapers added another layer. Literate citizens eagerly read printed broadsides that criticized governors, praised merchants, or discussed events from London. These writings planted seeds of political awareness that would later grow into revolution. But in the early 1700s, they mostly fueled curiosity and conversation. reading aloud became a social event, families gathering, while someone slowly pronounced each word by candlelight. Religion also offered a framework for charity and justice. Church leaders often acted as moral guardians, arbitrating disputes, disciplining misbehavior, and supporting the needy. Public shame sometimes replaced legal punishment, with wrongdoers forced to confess sins before the congregation. While harsh by modern standards, these practices reinforced the idea that each individual's actions affected the whole community. Morality wasn't private, it was communal property. Yet beneath strict rules, spiritual comfort remained real. People prayed over sick beds, over dangerous voyages, over childbirth, a time when many women's lives were genuinely at risk. They believed God watched, judged, but also protected. Psalms and hymns filled homes on winter evenings. Even those who doubted quietly often still participated in how to separate faith from identity, because both were woven tightly into daily experience. Over time, Boston's growing connection to the Atlantic world began subtly changing local habits. Exotic spices appeared rarely, giving everyday foods surprising flavor. Coffee houses opened, offering another setting for discussion and trade. Foreign books circulated, questioning old assumptions. Younger generations sometimes felt less bound to the severe discipline their grandparents accepted. Parents worried, elders fretted, and conversations turned toward what kind of society Boston should become. Tradition wrestled with adaptation. In all of this, the kitchen fire, the church pew, and the tavern stool became symbols of ordinary life. Around the fire, families nourished their bodies and whispered stories about the past. In church, they reflected on their souls and their responsibilities. In taverns, they argued, laughed, listened on, perhaps without realizing it practiced the beginnings of civic life. These simple spaces prepared the ground for bigger changes ahead. On a typical evening, as daylight faded and the town quieted, supper would be eaten early. Dishes were washed with cold water and coarse cloths. Ashes were carefully banked so the fire could be revived in the morning. Outside, the harbor creaked with the sound of ships rocking gently. Somewhere a dog barked. Somewhere else a baby cried. People settled under heavy blankets, often sharing beds to preserve warmth. Before sleeping, many whispered prayers, thanking God for a safe day and asking for protection for the next, aware that disease, storms, or misfortune could strike without warning. What ties all of these details together is how deeply interconnected life was. Food depended on seasons, weather, trade networks, and labor. Religion wove meaning through hardship and guided behavior. Community sustained people emotionally and practically, filling gaps that governments or institutions could not yet manage. Daily existence might have seemed small: cooking, praying, working, talking, but within those small acts lay a resilient culture that would ultimately face enormous change. So, when we imagine Boston in the 1700s, it isn't just a city of revolutionaries and famous names. It is a place where a pot simmered quietly while children did chores, a place where bells called everyone together week after week after week, place where neighbors watched out for one another, argued passionately, forgave, and sometimes, quieter and far more complicated, inequality. Beneath the familiar stories of freedom and resistance lay a society divided by class, race, gender, and opportunity. Not everyone experienced Boston the same way, and for many, the promise of liberty felt distant, fragile, or out of reach. Wealthy merchants walked streets with confidence, boots polished, coats tailored with imported fabrics from England. They owned businesses, warehouses, sometimes ships. They hosted dinners filled with silverware, candlelight, and carefully displayed tea sets. Their homes had multiple rooms, carpets, glass windows, and space to breathe, luxuries that instantly marked them as people of importance. For them, Boston was a place of opportunity, profit, and prestige. They read books, subscribed to newspapers, debated philosophy, and saw themselves as leaders in the making of a new world. A very different Boston existed not far away. Narrow lanes, smaller houses, damp basements, and crowded lofts sheltered artisans, laborers, widows, apprentices, and the poor. Shoes were patched repeatedly. Coats were worn until threadbare. Some families owned almost nothing beyond a few wooden chairs, a table, and essential cooking pots. Work was uncertain. If a shipwreck occurred or trade slowed, the ripple spread quickly. Fishermen lost wages, dock workers found themselves idle, and shopkeepers sold on credit, hoping customers could someday repay. Poverty in the 1700s was not just inconvenient, was dangerous. Hunger, sickness, and cold waited patiently for any sign of weakness. And threading quietly through both these worlds were enslaved men, women, and children, living proof that Boston's reputation as a city of liberty hid uncomfortable truths. They cooked meals they would not eat, cleaned houses they did not own, and raised children who would one day inherit wealth built partly on their unpaid labor. Some worked in homes, others in shops, some in shipyards or stables. Their names often appear in records only as possessions listed alongside livestock and furniture. Freedom, so loudly discussed in taverns and meeting halls, was something they could not claim. Their daily routines were shaped by obedience, fear, and resilience. Rising early, working long hours, sleeping in corners or small outbuildings, they navigated a world where punishment could be swift and legal. Yet they also preserved fragments of identity, songs hummed quietly, stories whispered, faith practiced in private, bonds formed among enslaved people across households, creating fragile networks of emotional survival. Every act of kindness or shared food was a reminder that humanity endured even inside systems designed to erase it. Native American communities, too, felt the weight of Boston's growing power. Once central to regional trade and diplomacy, they found themselves increasingly pushed to the edges, physically, politically, and culturally. Land was taken through treaties, debts, and force. Disease and displacement shattered communities. Many indigenous people worked as laborers or servants in colonial homes, their presence sometimes overlooked or forgotten in written history. They watched as forests disappeared, towns expanded, and foreign laws replaced traditional systems of governance. To them, the rise of Boston was not a triumphant story. It was a gradual narrowing of space and voice. Gender shaped inequality as profoundly as class or race. Women carried enormous responsibility, but possessed limited legal power. A married woman's property belonged to her husband, including her wages. She might run a household, manage children, help with business accounts, spin yarn, preserve food, and sometimes operate a small shop or boarding house. Yet she rarely appeared in official decision-making. Widows, especially poor ones, faced harsh choices. Without a male provider, they often relied on sewing, washing, or communal charity. Communities set aside funds for relief of the poor, but assistance was minimal and carefully scrutinized, often accompanied by judgment. Still, women were far from passive. They formed social bonds that supported families through births, illnesses, and mourning. They shared remedies, recipes, and practical wisdom passed down through generations. In taverns and town meetings, men talked politics. In kitchens and spinning circles, women quietly discussed the same issues, influencing households in subtle but powerful ways. Their work kept society functioning, even if public recognition was scarce. Apprentices occupied a world halfway between childhood and adulthood. A boy might leave his family at 7 or 8, moving into the home of a master craftsman. There he learned carpentry, printing, blacksmithing, or shoemaking, waking early, working long hours, obeying strict rules. In return, he received training, food, and eventually the hope of becoming a tradesman himself. Some masters were fair, others were harsh, using physical punishment or withholding promised opportunities. Apprenticeship offered upward mobility, but it also demanded obedience and years of sacrifice. Servants lived in similarly uncertain circumstances. Some came from poor families, others arrived from Europe under contracts, agreeing to work for years in exchange for passage across the Atlantic. Their futures depended entirely on employers' goodwill and economic stability. A change of fortune for one wealthy family could easily disrupt the lives of every servant inside the household. Crime and punishment reflected social divisions as well. Theft was common: stolen loaf of bread, pilfered tools, missing clothing, often driven by hunger or desperation. Courts displayed punishment publicly to deter others: stocks, whipping posts, and humiliating confessions. Prisons were small and unsanitary, intended more as temporary holding spaces than long-term confinement. Justice sought order and example rather than rehabilitation. But wealth and status sometimes softened consequences, while the poor bore the brunt of harsher sentences. Despite these disparities, Boston was not simply a city of oppressors and oppressed locked in constant conflict. It was also a web of relationships and responsibilities. Charity funds supported struggling families, neighbors loaned tools and food, and churches organized relief during fires or epidemics. The same society that enforced inequality also fostered compassion. People recognized one another's needs because survival required interdependence. Fires, especially, could transform the city overnight. Wooden houses stood close together, and a single spark could race across rooftops in minutes. When flames erupted, bells rang frantically. Buckets formed chains from wells to burning buildings. Rich and poor alike rushed to battle the blaze. Afterwards, ashes did not distinguish social class. Entire neighborhoods sometimes rebuilt together, sharing timber, nails, labor, and sorrow. Moments like these reminded residents that beneath their divisions, they were bound by place and fate. Taverns, those lively centers, where the pulse of ordinary life gathered, did more than serve drink. They echoed with the contradictions of the age, ambition and hardship, gossip and guidance, inequality and interdependence. And in that complex hum, Boston prepared itself not for glory, but for the quiet, relentless work of existence that would, in time, become the ground from which revolution could rise. Asterisk.